This is Matthew Cratter from Trady University, and today I want to talk about how we may be moving closer to something like World War III. One of the interesting things about history is when you read it in retrospect, when you read it backwards, it's very clear and it's very obvious, and people always wonder, students of history always wonder, why didn't people see it coming? But it's much more difficult, obviously, when you're living in real time and trying to interpret real-time events. So what I want to offer you today is just some of the things I'm watching geopolitically and in the markets, and we'll see if they lead to anything. But I think these are significant developments, so I wanted to cover them. We've been talking a lot about how the Fed tightening has the potential to blow up things globally, not just in markets, but to have effects on major economies and on geopolitical alliances. We've also talked a lot about how Russia's reserves, their FX reserves, being canceled by the EU, and the US really has been pushing Russia and China together as allies. We've talked about how they've done a lot of recent energy deals. We've talked about how the Saudis are now, looks like they're willing to sell the Chinese oil denominated in yuan. So I want to talk a little bit more about what's happening in the relationship between China and Russia today. There have been a lot of rumors over the weekend that Beijing may go into a lockdown similar to what Shanghai has been experiencing. This caused the Chinese stock market, the indices, to be down quite sharply, anywhere between 3 and 4% in Shanghai and Shenzhen. And there's been testing going on in a district in Beijing, and so people think that Beijing may be going into lockdown. This obviously does not bode well for supply chain disruptions, and as a result could have inflationary pressures on the U.S. And there's been a lot of talk about the lockdowns, but I think this was an interesting tweet. Chinese lockdowns have not yet had an impact on U.S. supply chains. This is about to happen. Container volumes leaving China are set to drop by over 50% within the next 2 weeks, and this is without even a Beijing lockdown. If you're finding this video helpful so far, be sure to hit that subscribe and like button. So one of the things that's happening as well is that we're seeing dollar strength, not just against the euro, but now we're finally seeing dollar strength against the Chinese yuan. When this chart is moving upwards, that is a sign of dollar strength. If the line is moving up, if it's moving down, it's a sign of Chinese yuan strength and dollar weakness. And we can see a really large reversal, especially over the weekend, continuing from the end of last week. And what this does is this obviously makes Chinese exports to the U.S. much less competitive. It's hard to know here whether the U.S. dollar is strengthening against the yuan because of these potential Beijing lockdowns, or the lockdowns leading to more inflation, or it just could be that the relative currency, the relative interest rate differentials are getting too wide, and that this is another sign, the dollar strengthening against all other currencies is a sign that U.S. monetary policy is too tight. When the dollar gets too strong, it blows things up, blows up stock markets worldwide and causes contagion. So I keep flip-flopping on this. I'm not totally sure whether this is the U.S. dollar strength against the yuan is a sign of the lockdowns, or if this is really just a sign of the U.S. fighting a war using its central bank and trying to strengthen the U.S. dollar and hurting Chinese exports in the process. We saw over the weekend China changing their bank's FX reserves to try to stem the yuan weakness. They're also doing something else which I think slipped under the radar of a lot of the mainstream media outlets. Over the weekend, we saw Y-20 transports presumably flying weapons to Serbia from China. And this is quite significant, especially in the context of what we've been seeing coming out of Serbia. Serbia saying that they may not be as interested in joining the EU as they said they were, and basically renewing their age-old alliance with Russia. This may be a move where they're basically looking in the crystal ball and seeing the Russian army coming through Ukraine and Moldova on the way to Serbia. And they have been, this is something the Serbs would probably welcome. There has been historically a strong alliance here because of the Orthodox roots. But I think this is quite significant. This again shows this growing alliance between China, Russia, and then Russia's potential satellites. This was confirmed by Harold Malmgren, who's always very interesting to read on Twitter. He says Putin would no doubt like a re-eruption of Balkan conflicts. If you're around in the late 1990s, you remember all these issues, driven by Serbia in parallel with the next Russian drive to Transnistria and Moldova, to be followed by a Russian drive into Moldova neighbors, as slow motion phases of Putin's World War III with the U.S. And then his daughter, this was actually in response to his daughter, saying Putin and his people, as I was saying, Putin and his people see Serbia as Russia. This buildup of weapons and material will be exactly like Ukraine. Don't forget that China is still angry about the U.S. bombing of their embassy in Belgrade. Balkan battles coming. So this really dates back to some things that happened in the late 90s. And a lot of countries have very long memories. I would say the U.S. has a very short memory. Countries like Russia and China, they remember historical slights, I think, much better. So this is what Pipa Malmgren is referring to. The Chinese embassy in Belgrade was using an antenna to pick up NATO bomb frequency, GPS bomb frequencies. This was in 1999. And then the Chinese embassy was giving those frequencies to the Serbs to allow them to be prepared and to jam NATO bombs. So this is an old issue coming back to roost. And this is another way we can see the Chinese-Russian alliance being strengthened. And China, in spite of all its problems, in spite of people potentially starving in its various large cities, is still has the time and effort and money to send some jets over to Serbia to help to rearm them. If you know the history of World War I, you know how that started in this area as well. So I think these are very important moves to watch. The really bizarre thing, of course, is that Europe is still funding Russia by buying their oil, and it's hard to see how they're going to be able to avoid this. So this is where the economics of it become extremely important. If you want to take a look at a map, here's the Ukraine, here's Moldova, Romania in between, and then Serbia. So it is quite a long push, but I think it's definitely something to keep an eye on. Obviously, this is a various chess moves being made by China and Russia, and I think it's good to keep an eye on them as well. Another thing that Serbia remembers and that Russia remembers was that Serbia was bombed by NATO at the beginning of Holy Week, going through Orthodox Easter or Pascha back in 1999. Orthodox Easter, also known as Pascha, was March 29th in 1999. NATO started their bombing on March 24th. So you have two U.S. enemies. You have China still mad about the bombing of the Belgrade embassy, and you have Serbia and Russia remembering this attack by NATO. And whether you agreed with it or whether you didn't agree with it, there was a conscious decision to do this during Holy Week and to do it on Easter. And this is something that could come home to roost as well. So the general point of this video, the wheels are coming off of the current system. Expect more turbulence, more volatility as we continue to move through monetary and geopolitical reset. It's very interesting to keep in mind the flows of energy and crude oil and who needs what from whom, as well as viewing the closer, ever-growing closer alliance between China and Russia. And I would say it again, especially as the Fed remains this tight, disrupting currency markets, disrupting equity markets, you really do have the potential for things to get rapidly more chaotic. And so that's what I've tried to draw out in this video, to look at the effects that this is having geopolitically. If you found this video helpful, be sure to hit that subscribe and like button. Hit the notification bell if you want to be notified when I publish my next video. And let me know your questions and comments in the comment section below. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.